Hello, my name is Andy. How are you? Let's talk about the Luwian language.
Luwili.
Luwian is an ancient, extinct language spoken across much of what is now Turkey and northern Syria from roughly 1800 to 700 BCE. It belongs to the Anatolian branch of the Indo-European language family, the same broad family that includes English, Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit, and is actually the oldest branching group within that family, making it one of the earliest Indo-European languages ever recorded. Luwian is the sister language of Hittite, not a descendant of it, and its closest relatives are Lycian, Carian, and Pisidian. One of its most distinctive grammatical features is a possessive suffix asa that can be layered onto words in chains, a structure found nowhere in Hittite. It also preserves very ancient sounds like laryngeals, consonants that had already disappeared in Greek, Latin, and every other Indo-European language, which makes it extraordinarily valuable to linguists. In fact, a French scholar named Ferdinand de Saussure predicted the existence of these sounds in 1879, based purely on logic and internal comparison. And when Luwian and Hittite were later deciphered, those sounds were found exactly where he said they would be. One of the greatest confirmations of the comparative methods in the history of linguistics. Luwian is unique among ancient languages in being written in two completely different scripts. Cuneiform Luwian uses the same wedge-shaped clay tablet writing system the Hittites borrowed from Mesopotamia. But Luwian passages within Hittite tablets were flagged by scribes with the word Luwili, meaning in the Luwian manner. Almost everything written in cuneiform Luwian consists of religious rituals, incantations, healing spells, and purification ceremonies, often naming the ritual specialists who performed them, such as Mastiga, Palya, and Tunnawi, who came from Luwian-speaking regions. Hieroglyphic Luwian, by contrast, is a completely independent writing system that was invented in Anatolia itself, with no connection to Egyptian hieroglyphs beyond a superficial visual similarity. It combines picture-based word signs, syllable signs, and silent category markers, and was primarily carved in stone on palace walls, city gates, rock faces, and royal monuments. Inscriptions are often written in Boustrophedon style, alternating line directions, like a farmer plowing a field back and forth, with the pictorial signs always facing the direction of reading. The script was largely misread until 1973, when scholars Hawkins, Morpurgo Davis, and Neumann made a crucial correction. Many signs read as E actually carried an A value, which changed the understanding of the grammar fundamentally. The key that unlocked this correction was the Karatepe inscription from 720 to 700 BCE, the longest known hieroglyphic Luwian text, written parallel versions in both Luwian and Phoenician, functioning like a Rosetta Stone for the script. Other major inscriptions include the Karkamish royal records and the Ivris rock relief, which shows a king receiving gifts of grain and grapes from the storm god. The Luwians were not a single nation or empire, but a widespread group of communities sharing a common language, set of gods, and cultural traditions across western Turkey, Cilicia, and eventually northern Syria. Rather than one centralized state, they lived under regional kings, each bearing the Luwian title Tarwani, meaning lord or ruler, who governed their own territories, sometimes as independent rulers and sometimes as vassal kings under Hittite authority. Society was layered in the typical ancient Near Eastern fashion, royalty and warrior nobility at the top, followed by landowners, farmers, craftspeople, and religious specialists, with dependent laborers and slaves at the base. Women held a notably prominent role in the documented ritual tradition, with several female practitioners named in Hittite preserved Luwian ritual texts. The economy was built on grain farming, winemaking, sheep and cattle herding, horse breeding. Horses were enormously valuable in the ancient world, and trade supported by Anatolia's rich deposits of copper, silver, and lead. The Neo-Hittite city of Carchemish, sitting at the main crossing points of the Euphrates River, became one of the most important and prosperous trade hubs in the ancient Near East. Throughout their history, the Luwians interacted with nearly every major civilization around them. The Hittites, political subordination and deep cultural fusion. The Mycenaean Greeks, competition over Western Anatolian territories. Egypt, diplomacy after the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE. Hurrian-influenced Kilkia, Phoenician trading cities, Aramean neighbors, and ultimately the Assyrian Empire, whose military expansion dismantled the last Luwian kingdoms between the 9th and 7th centuries BCE. The earliest signs of Luwian speakers appear around 1950 to 1750 BCE in the form of personal names found on clay tablets from an ancient Assyrian trading colony at Gültepe in central Turkey. By the Bronze Age, Luwian-speaking communities dominated much of western Anatolia, organized into a loose network of kingdoms including Artawa, Mira, and Wilusa. Their relationship with the neighboring Hittite Empire was complicated. The Hittites repeatedly conquered and absorbed Luwian territories. Yet, Luwian religious specialists held honored positions at the Hittite royal court, and the two cultures became deeply intertwined over centuries. When the Bronze Age world collapsed around 1200 BCE, due to a combination of invasions, droughts, and economic breakdown, the Hittite Empire fell. But Luwian culture survived through a series of smaller Iron Age kingdoms such as Carchemish, Melid, and Tabal, known collectively as the Neo-Hittite states, which continued until Assyrian military conquest erased the last of them by 717 BCE. As for Troy, most scholars today are convinced that the Hittite name Wilusa refers to ancient Troy. The evidence is compelling. The name Wilusa matches the early Greek form Wilion, which later became Ilion or Ilios, after the Greeks dropped the initial W sound, with near-perfect phonological regularity. A treaty dated to around 1280 BCE names the king of Wilusa as Alexandru, strikingly similar to Alexandros or Alexander, the alternative Greek name of Paris of Troy. The name Paris itself is probably of Luwian origin, while the resemblance between Alexandru and Alexandros has long been noted as another possible link between Hittite records and the Trojan tradition. A later Hittite letter also references a past military dispute between the Hittites and the Mycenaean Greeks over Wilusa, suggesting that real conflict over the Trojan region did occur. Though this establishes a historical backdrop for the Trojan tradition rather than confirming the specific events of Homer's Iliad. Luwian culture was held together by a rich tradition of religion, arts, and ritual language that persisted from the Bronze Age through the Iron Age. At its center stood the storm god Targunt, the king of the gods, bringer of rain, and guarantor of royal power, depicted most dramatically in the Ivris rock relief, where he towers over a king while pouring out grain and grapes. Other important deities included the sun Tiwat, the moon god Arma, the healing goddess Kamrusepa, and most consequentially Kubaba, the goddess of Carchemish, whose cult spread to the Phrygians, who called her Kubele, and eventually to Rome, where she was welcomed as a state goddess in 204 BCE, making her the most far-reaching cultural exports of the Luwian world. Religious life revolved around elaborate multi-day festivals involving sacrifice, communal feasting, and musical performances with lyres, lutes, and drums. Their ritual texts, some of the oldest surviving Indo-European verbal compositions, worked by reciting mythological precedents to justify and empower healing and purification ceremonies. In art, the Neo-Hittite kingdoms produced a vivid sculptural tradition. Large stone relief panels called orthostats lined palace gateways depicting hunts, battle scenes, royal processions, and protective lions and sphinxes, a visual style later admired and imitated by the Assyrians themselves. Their palaces featured a distinctive columned entrance design, or bit ghilani, that became a recognized architectural form across the ancient Near East. Legal life followed the Hittite laws, notably moderate for their era, preferring fines and compensation over execution in many cases. And diplomacy used treaty formats that invoked Luwian gods as divine witnesses alongside Hittite deities. The legacy of Luwian culture reaches far, through the Kubela cults into Roman religion, through Lycian into the classical worlds, and through the preservation of ancient laryngeal sounds into the very foundations of modern Indo-European linguistic science. In the next part, let's listen to the beautiful sounds of their language. Vocabulary:
Akhadada, As, Anemiamis, Alis, Arin, Asgar, Anan, Arzia, Arayanza, Alassam, Alattarza, Abbas, Ariat, Aruda, Awi, Ammasa, An, Andan, Anis, Anzas, Arma, Asati, Asta, Astu, Atswa, Darus, Dasda, Dakuis, Dur, Dua, Dutariati, Ilga, Kaska, Kalutaima, Kulja, Gabinni, Gamsadi, Gamsukala, Gandawatis, Ganna, Gantis, Gappis, Gattas, Gattusa, Galal, Galissa, Galmaswit, Galta, Garduatpi, Guga, Guppar, Izarwilis, Ibala, Ibarwa, Idi, Iaza, Isari, Imma, Irgata, Imma, Kaldunni, Kaldunnis, Kalmianni, Kamruziba, Kapilallis, Kars, Kiza, Kizamma, Kinan, Quis, Quizga, Kurammi, Kumma, Kualanalli, Kuali, Kuari, Kuayatas, Lalli, Lappi, Labarna, Lilua, Luludi, Lunni, Masani, Man, Malgu, Mali, Mawa, Masanalli, Madu, Malgasa, Mali, Mana, Mu, Na, Nana, Nanyan, Nanun, Nadata, Nawa, Ninial, Nudu, Ba, Parta, Pagur, Pas, Pahit, Papakurwa, Papra, Pazuria, Pari, Padas, Palga, Parna, Paran, Parzakis, Pia, Puna, Saptam, Samlu, Sarlata, Sarra, Sari, Sigwa, Sitar, Su, Suaru, Suarus, Suatar, Tapa, Tapanin, Tapas, Targuntas, Tarmis, Tidan, Tidaimis, Titit, Tiwads, Tiamis, Tuman, Walwa, Winal, Widan, Wilusa, Wini, Ulantis, Urannu, Uratsas, Udar, Unza, Uti, Usa, Warsa, Wasu, Wawi, Wasa, Wasratsa, Walit, Wartali, Warwalan, Gawa, Warwalya, Wana, Wanatis, Tsawin, Tsas, Tsarta, Tsiari, Tsiri, Tsuan, Tsugrip, Tsuani, Tadi.
Sample text.
Amuami adjatiwadas, piwadamis tsidis, taraguntas rudarlis, Awaricus queen, maranuatta, adanawanis, gantawadis, wamutargunsas, annatintadin ka, itsitta, piadu targunsas, arga usunawamis, tsaizigarnisasi, masaninsi, adjati wadaya, araya, valia, miyantinsiga, usansi, sanawasaga, tamiriza, mudiawaninsi, masaninsi, wasu awinto, lalamansa quis arga, garari, sidin targunsas, masaninsiga, arga marnuntu, armas pawan, garadu, apapawa ni karawasa, tsuaninsi apazin, garmagin arga datu, tadistiwad, uratsa, tadinsi masanimtsi, girodal, awidu pasta, malgasanis niyas, garat nabi, waskolimadi, mamalwayan, malgasasis niyas, adwalin lalan.